The acetylene torch hissed and sputtered against the rusted metal seam, sending sparks cascading down the curved wall of the abandoned grain silo. Mark Henderson's hands trembled slightly as he worked the blue flame along the welded edge, sweat dripping from beneath his hard hat despite the crisp October morning. He had purchased this foreclosed property 6 months ago for just $15,000 at a county auction, thinking he'd scored the deal of a lifetime. But nothing could have prepared him for what waited behind that sealed door, or how quickly his ordinary Tuesday morning would spiral into a federal investigation that would attract agents from 3 different government agencies before lunch. The metal groaned as the final section of the weld gave way, and Mark felt his stomach drop. Through the narrow gap, he could see something that didn't belong in an agricultural structure. The beam from his headlamp caught the edge of something smooth and metallic, gleaming in the darkness. His breathing quickened as reality set in. This wasn't abandoned farming equipment. This was something else entirely, something someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The door hadn't just been welded shut from the outside. It had been sealed with military-grade precision, the kind of work that required specialized equipment and training. Before we reveal what Mark found behind that door, we need to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Are you in a small town like Mark's, or are you watching from a big city? Your location might surprise you when you learn how close these secrets are to everyday communities across America. Drop your location below, and let's see how far this story reaches. Now, let's rewind 6 months to understand how Mark ended up at this exact moment, staring into the darkness of a sealed silo that would change his life forever. Mark Henderson had always considered himself a practical man, someone who saw opportunities where others saw problems. At 42 years old, he'd built a modest real estate portfolio by purchasing distressed properties, fixing them up, and either renting or reselling them for profit. His strategy was simple: buy low, invest wisely, and sell high. When he saw the listing for a 12-acre property with a grain silo and old farmhouse in rural Nebraska listed at the county foreclosure auction, he immediately recognized potential. The property had belonged to the deceased estate of Thomas Whitmore, a reclusive farmer who'd died without heirs 3 years earlier. The auction took place on a gray April morning at the county courthouse. Mark arrived early, clipboard in hand, ready to compete with other bargain hunters and developers. But, as the auctioneer rattled through the property details, he noticed something strange. The room remained eerily quiet. No competing bids emerged. The starting price dropped from $30,000 to $20,000, then $15,000. Mark raised his paddle, expecting others to follow. Instead, silence. The auctioneer's gavel came down with startling finality. Sold. $15,000. Mark felt a surge of excitement mixed with an unsettling question. Why hadn't anyone else wanted this property? Over the following weeks, Mark learned more about Thomas Whitmore, the property's previous owner. Local residents described him as intensely private, someone who'd lived on that farm for over 40 years without forming close relationships with neighbors. The grain silo had been built in the 1970s, during a brief period when Whitmore had attempted commercial farming. But within a few years, he'd stopped agricultural operations entirely, yet he'd remained on the property, living in the small farmhouse and rarely venturing into town. The few people who'd visited the property remembered Whitmore as polite but distant, always deflecting questions about his past. Mark's initial inspection of the property revealed typical rural decay. The farmhouse needed extensive repairs: sagging porch, broken windows, outdated electrical systems. The surrounding land was overgrown but salvageable. The grain silo, a cylindrical tower standing 60 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter, appeared structurally sound despite years of neglect. Mark planned to convert it into a unique rental property or perhaps a quirky vacation home, capitalizing on the growing trend of agricultural tourism. He'd seen similar conversions online selling for $200,000 or more. His $15,000 investment seemed brilliant. But during his second inspection, something caught his attention. While examining the silo's interior access points, Mark discovered that the main ground-level entrance had been welded shut from the outside. Not just locked or boarded up, completely sealed with professional-grade welding. The door itself was industrial steel, designed to withstand the pressures and conditions of grain storage. Someone had spent considerable time and effort ensuring this door would never open easily. The welds were thick, uniform, and clearly the work of someone with expertise. Mark found this odd but initially assumed it was a security measure from when the silo was decommissioned. However, the more Mark investigated, the stranger things became. The external ladder leading to the silo's upper hatch had been partially removed, making access from above nearly impossible without specialized equipment. The few small ventilation openings had been sealed with concrete. Every possible entry point had been methodically blocked. It wasn't just about keeping people out, it felt like someone had been determined to keep something in, or at least keep it hidden. Mark consulted with local contractors who confirmed the work was professional and relatively recent, probably completed within the last 10 to 15 years. The mystery deepened when Mark attempted to research permits and modifications for the property. County records showed no applications for structural changes to the silo after its initial construction in 1976. Yet the welding and sealing had clearly occurred much later. Someone had done this work without official documentation or inspection. Mark started asking questions around town, but responses were vague and unhelpful. Some older residents mentioned seeing activity at the Whitmore property occasionally, vehicles coming and going at odd hours, but no one had specific information. The police chief suggested that Whitmore had simply been eccentric and security conscious. By October, Mark had completed renovations on the farmhouse and was ready to tackle the silo conversion. He'd obtained all necessary permits, hired a structural engineer to assess the building's integrity, and developed detailed plans for transforming the space into a multi-level luxury rental. But first, he needed access. That welded door had to come off. Mark purchased an acetylene cutting torch and protective equipment, watching online tutorials about metal cutting techniques. On that Tuesday morning, October 15th, he arrived at the property just after dawn, fired up the torch, and began cutting through the welds that had sealed the silo for years. The cutting process took longer than Mark had anticipated. Each pass of the torch revealed more layers of welding, some older and oxidized, others relatively fresh and bright. Someone had returned to this door multiple times over the years, adding additional layers of security. As Mark worked, he couldn't shake the growing unease settling in his chest. Normal people don't weld doors shut like this. Normal storage doesn't require this level of security. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this old farming equipment? Chemicals? Maybe Whitmore had been paranoid about theft and stored valuable machinery inside, but none of those explanations felt adequate. By 9:30 in the morning, Mark had cut through approximately 70% of the weld. The door was starting to shift slightly in its frame, metal groaning under the stress of the partial release. He paused to wipe sweat from his forehead and drink water, his arms aching from holding the torch steady for hours. The autumn sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields surrounding the silo. Birds chirped in nearby trees, oblivious to the mounting tension. Mark checked his phone. No signal, as usual. The property sat in a cellular dead zone, one of its few drawbacks. Mark resumed cutting, focusing on the final section of weld near the bottom hinge. The torch flame danced and flickered as it met the metal, and suddenly, with a loud crack, a segment of the weld gave way completely. The door shifted several inches, creating a narrow vertical gap approximately 4 inches wide. Cold air rushed out from inside the silo, carrying an odd smell. Not decay or mold, but something chemical and sterile, like a hospital or laboratory. Mark immediately shut off the torch and set it aside. He grabbed his powerful LED flashlight and approached the gap cautiously. Peering through the opening, Mark's beam of light penetrated the darkness within. Instead of the expected empty grain storage space or rusty farming equipment, his light reflected off smooth metallic surfaces. He could make out the edges of what appeared to be large rectangular containers, stacked systematically along the walls. They weren't agricultural. The surfaces were too clean, too precisely manufactured. Each container bore stenciled markings, though he couldn't read them clearly from his limited vantage point. Some showed faded government insignia that looked vaguely military but weren't quite right. Mark's pulse quickened. This wasn't just strange. This was potentially serious. His mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities. Had Whitmore been involved in something illegal? Were these containers filled with drugs, stolen goods, or something worse? The professional welding, the sealed entrances, the complete isolation. It all suddenly felt deliberate and ominous. Mark stepped back from the door, considering his next move. Should he call the police now? Or should he finish opening the door and document everything first? His curiosity warred with caution. He decided to continue cutting, reasoning that he needed to know exactly what he was dealing with before involving authorities. If this turned out to be nothing, old paint cans or legitimate stored goods, he'd look foolish. Mark fired up the torch again and attacked the remaining welds with renewed urgency. Within 20 minutes, he'd cut through enough metal to allow the door to swing partially open. The hinges protested loudly, rust flaking away as the door moved for the first time in years. Mark wedged it open wider with a pry bar, creating an entrance large enough to walk through. Standing at the threshold, Mark shone his flashlight into the interior systematically, scanning from floor to ceiling. The silo's internal space had been completely modified from its original agricultural purpose. Metal shelving units lined the curved walls, rising at least 30 feet high. On these shelves sat dozens of sealed containers, all identical in size and shape, rectangular boxes approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep. Each container was made of heavy-gauge steel with robust locking mechanisms. The boxes were arranged with military precision, and every single one bore similar faded markings and serial numbers. But that wasn't what made Mark's blood run cold. In the center of the silo floor sat a larger structure, a climate-controlled storage vault approximately 10 feet by 10 feet by 8 feet tall, constructed from reinforced steel. It hummed quietly, powered by an electrical system that Mark traced to a concealed generator setup in a corner recess. Someone had been maintaining power to this vault for years. The generator was modern, well-maintained, and equipped with an automatic fuel system connected to buried tanks. This wasn't abandoned at all. This was active, operational, and someone had been taking care of it. Mark approached the central vault carefully, his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his unsteady hands. The vault door featured a sophisticated electronic locking mechanism, far more advanced than anything that should exist in a rural Nebraska silo. A small LED panel glowed green, indicating the system was powered and functional. Above the door, stenciled in faded but still readable letters, was a designation: USF-DOD Classified Project, Silverthorne, 1987. Mark's stomach dropped. United States Air Force, Department of Defense, classified. This wasn't private property. This was government material, and he'd just broken into it. His first instinct was to leave immediately, lock everything back up, and pretend he'd never opened that door. But it was too late. He'd cut through government seals. He could see them now, official-looking strips of metal with Department of Defense logos that he'd sliced through with his torch. He'd already committed what was probably a federal crime, albeit unknowingly. Mark pulled out his phone again. Still no signal. He'd need to drive to town to call the police. But before he did, he needed to document everything. His lawyer would want evidence that he'd contacted authorities immediately upon discovery. Mark began taking photographs with his phone camera, methodically capturing every angle of the interior. He photographed the containers on the shelves, the central vault, the electrical systems, the markings and serial numbers. He took close-ups of the Department of Defense designations and the dates he could find. Some containers showed manufacture dates from the mid-1980s. Others were labeled with cryptic codes he didn't understand. As he documented the space, Mark noticed something else: a filing cabinet tucked behind the generator setup. Unable to resist, he opened it and found folders containing documents with classified stamps across every page. Mark's hands trembled as he carefully pulled the first folder from the filing cabinet, conscious that he was now definitely crossing into territory that could land him in serious legal trouble. The folder's tab was labeled Project Silverthorne, Phase 3, Personnel Files, and inside were dozens of pages filled with names, photographs, and biographical information about military personnel and civilian contractors. Most entries dated from 1986 through 1992. The photographs showed men and women in military uniforms and lab coats, standing in front of equipment Mark didn't recognize. Their faces were serious, professional, completely unaware that decades later their classified files would be discovered in a sealed grain silo in rural Nebraska. Each personnel file contained detailed background checks, security clearance levels, and assignment summaries that revealed nothing concrete about what Project Silverthorne actually entailed. The language was deliberately vague, filled with bureaucratic euphemisms and coded references. Terms like advanced materials testing, atmospheric analysis, and deep storage protocols appeared repeatedly, but without context they meant nothing. What struck Mark most was the classification level stamped on every page: top secret, compartmented, no foreign nationals. This wasn't just classified material. This was among the highest levels of government secrecy, the kind of stuff that even most military personnel never encountered. Deeper in the cabinet, Mark found technical documents that made his engineering background seem woefully inadequate. Diagrams showed complex systems involving what appeared to be radiation shielding, hermetic sealing mechanisms, and long-term preservation technologies far beyond standard industrial applications. One schematic depicted the exact layout of the silo he was standing in, including modifications that had transformed it from agricultural storage into what the documents called a secure deep storage facility for sensitive materials requiring indefinite isolation from population centers. The date on the blueprint was April 1987, just 11 years after the silo's original construction. Another folder contained correspondence between military officials and Thomas Whitmore himself. Mark's heart raced as he read letters dated from 1986, in which Air Force procurement officers negotiated with Whitmore to lease his property for national security purposes requiring absolute discretion. The compensation was substantial. Whitmore received $10,000 monthly for the next 20 years, totaling $2,400,000 in lease payments. No wonder he'd been able to live comfortably without farming. He'd been paid handsomely to host a secret government storage facility and keep his mouth shut about it. The most disturbing folder was labeled simply Inventory Manifest, Critical Items. Mark opened it with growing dread and found detailed lists of what was stored in those metal containers lining the walls and, more importantly, what occupied the central climate-controlled vault. The manifest listed items with alphanumeric designations rather than descriptive names: Unit CR-227 through CR-384, Assembly Package Beta 9 through Beta 23, and Core Components Sigma Series Complete Set. Beside each designation were numbers representing quantity, weight, estimated half-life, and containment integrity status. Half-life. That was a term used for radioactive materials. Mark's mouth went dry as the implications crashed over him. This wasn't just classified military equipment. These were nuclear materials or components, stored secretly on private land far from military bases where oversight and accountability might reveal their existence. Project Silverthorne wasn't about legitimate defense operations. It was about hiding something, possibly materials that shouldn't exist according to international treaties or domestic regulations. The dates aligned perfectly with the Cold War's final years, when various arms reduction treaties were being negotiated and signed. Had someone hidden excess nuclear materials here to avoid reporting them? Further reading revealed that the initial storage period was meant to be temporary, perhaps 5 to 10 years, until diplomatic circumstances permitted proper disposal through official channels. But those circumstances apparently never materialized. The documents showed that monitoring visits occurred quarterly through 1999, then annually until 2007, then stopped entirely. The final inspection report, dated November 2007, noted that subject property custodian continues to maintain facility security per original agreement. No breaches detected. Materials remain stable. Recommend continued passive monitoring until political climate permits extraction. That was 18 years ago. Mark realized with growing horror that this installation had been forgotten. Not accidentally, but deliberately. Whoever created Project Silverthorn had intended for these materials to remain hidden indefinitely, stored secretly on private land with a single civilian caretaker who had every financial incentive to stay quiet. When Whitmore died in 2022, the secret should have died with him. No one was supposed to buy this property at auction. No one was supposed to cut through those welds and discover what lay inside. Mark had stumbled into a classified operation that powerful people had worked very hard to erase from official records. The generator in the corner suddenly sputtered and coughed, drawing Mark's attention. He walked over to examine it more closely and discovered it was nearly out of fuel. The buried tanks had run dry sometime in the past few months, and the generator had been running on fumes, keeping the climate-controlled vault operational for as long as possible. According to the gauges, the vault's internal temperature had been rising slowly over the past weeks. Whatever was inside needed that climate control. If the vault failed completely, if the temperature regulation stopped working, Mark had no idea what might happen to materials that had been sealed away for nearly 40 years. This discovery pushed Mark past his paralysis. He couldn't just walk away and pretend this didn't exist. If those were actually nuclear materials, and if they were becoming unstable due to failing containment systems, this wasn't just a legal problem. It was a potential public safety crisis. Mark quickly gathered several folders of documentation, stuffing them into his backpack as evidence. He took final photographs of the vault's control panel, which showed slowly climbing internal temperatures and declining battery backup reserves. Within days or weeks, that vault would lose all power. Then what? Mark backed out of the silo, leaving the door partially open behind him. The October morning had turned into afternoon, and shadows were lengthening across the property. He practically ran to his truck parked near the farmhouse, threw his equipment and backpack into the bed, and jumped into the driver's seat. His hands shook as he started the engine. The nearest town with cellular service was Garrison, population 3,200, about 12 miles away. Mark pulled onto the dirt road leading away from his property, dust billowing behind his truck as he accelerated faster than was probably safe on the rutted surface. The drive to Garrison felt interminable, even though Mark covered the 12 miles in less than 15 minutes. His mind raced faster than his truck, cycling through scenarios and consequences. Should he call the local police first? The county sheriff? Or should he go straight to federal authorities? What if nobody believed him? What if they thought he was crazy or trying to pull some kind of hoax? Worse, what if the people who'd created Project Silverthorn were still out there, still powerful, still invested in keeping this secret buried? Mark realized he might have just made himself a liability to people who'd proven willing to hide nuclear materials for decades. As he reached the outskirts of Garrison, his phone finally picked up cellular signal. It immediately began buzzing with notifications, email alerts, missed calls, text messages from his contractor about the farmhouse renovation. Mark ignored all of it and pulled into the parking lot of a gas station on Main Street. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to decide on his next move. His engineering training kicked in, forcing him to think logically through the problem. Evidence first. He needed to document everything while his memory was fresh. before involving authorities who might confiscate his phone and backpack. Mark opened a voice recording app on his phone and began narrating everything he'd discovered, speaking quickly but clearly. He described the sealed silo, the welded door, the interior layout, the containers, the vault, the documents, the nuclear terminology, Project Silverthorn, Thomas Whitmore's involvement, the lease payments, the abandoned monitoring schedule. He spoke for 12 minutes straight, creating an audio record that captured details he might forget under the stress of official questioning. When he finished, he immediately uploaded the recording to his cloud storage account along with all the photographs he'd taken inside the silo. Next, Mark photographed every page from the folders he'd taken, using his phone's document scanner feature to create clear, readable images. This took nearly 30 minutes, during which several people walked past his truck giving him curious glances. Small-town life meant strangers were noticed, and Mark's Nebraska license plate marked him as local, but his frantic behavior marked him as troubled. He worked through all the documents systematically, ensuring he had digital backups of the personnel files, technical schematics, correspondence with Whitmore, inventory manifests, and inspection reports. Everything uploaded to the cloud, secured behind passwords, backed up across multiple servers. Only then did Mark allow himself to make the call. He dialed 911, and the county emergency dispatcher answered on the second ring. Mark took a deep breath and tried to sound calm and rational, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. He identified himself, gave his location, and said he needed to report the discovery of what appeared to be classified military materials on his property. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately from routine professionalism to sharp attention. She asked him to repeat what he'd just said. Mark did, adding that he'd found documentation suggesting the materials were nuclear in nature and had been stored secretly for nearly 40 years. The dispatcher asked Mark to remain at his current location and not to return to the property. She said she was contacting the county sheriff immediately and that officers would arrive within 10 minutes. Mark agreed and ended the call, then sat in his truck feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. He'd done the right thing. He'd reported it. But now events were out of his control, and he had no idea how this would unfold. Would they believe him? Would they think he was overreacting? Or would they understand the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into hidden behind that welded silo door? 8 minutes later, 2 county sheriff cruisers pulled into the gas station parking lot, lights flashing but sirens silent. 4 officers emerged, hands resting on their duty weapons but not drawn. The lead officer, a man in his 50s with sergeant stripes, approached Mark's truck carefully. Mark lowered his window and raised his hand slightly, trying to look non-threatening. The sergeant introduced himself as Sergeant Bradley Morrison and asked Mark to step out of the vehicle. Mark complied, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. Morrison's expression was serious but not hostile. He asked Mark to explain exactly what he'd found. If you're enjoying this discovery and want to see how this unfolds, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens when federal agents arrive. The next hour will change everything for Mark, and you won't believe how quickly this escalates. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because what the government does next is absolutely shocking. Now, let's continue with what happened after Mark's call brought more than just local police to his doorstep. Mark recounted his story to Sergeant Morrison, trying to remain factual and avoid speculation. He explained the property purchase, the sealed silo, his decision to cut through the welds, the discovery of the interior storage facility, and the classified documents he'd found. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively more concerned. When Mark mentioned finding references to nuclear materials and Department of Defense designations, Morrison held up a hand to stop him. He turned to one of the other officers and instructed him to contact the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency immediately and request they notify federal authorities. The situation escalated rapidly from there. Within 20 minutes, Mark found himself surrounded by multiple law enforcement agencies. State police arrived first, followed by agents from the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency equipped with radiation detection equipment. They questioned Mark extensively about exactly what he'd touched, how long he'd been inside the silo, and whether he'd opened any of the sealed containers. Mark assured them he hadn't opened anything except the filing cabinet, and he'd only been inside for approximately 45 minutes total. The agents used handheld radiation detectors to scan Mark and his truck. To everyone's relief, the readings showed normal background radiation levels. By 3:30 that afternoon, less than 6 hours after Mark had started cutting through the welded door, federal agents began arriving in Garrison. First came representatives from the Department of Energy's Office of Secure Transportation, a division Mark had never heard of, but which apparently specialized in handling nuclear materials. Then came agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the military's version of the FBI. Finally, several unmarked vehicles arrived carrying men and women in civilian clothes who flashed credentials but didn't offer detailed explanations of which agency they represented. Mark counted at least 15 federal agents converging on this tiny Nebraska town. The federal agents took over completely, politely but firmly removing local and state law enforcement from the investigation. Mark was separated from the local officers and placed under what they called protective custody, though it felt more like detention. 2 agents drove him to the county sheriff's office where they'd commandeered a conference room. There, Mark underwent hours of questioning by rotating teams of agents. They wanted to know everything: how he'd learned about the property, why he'd purchased it, whether he'd told anyone about his discovery, who else knew about the silo, whether he'd published anything online or contacted media outlets. Mark answered truthfully, explaining he'd told no one because he'd planned to contact authorities immediately after documenting what he'd found. He showed them his phone with the uploaded photographs and audio recording. The agents studied the images intently, conferring in low voices. One agent, who identified herself as Dr. Patricia Vance from the Department of Energy, seemed particularly interested in the vault's control panel readings. She asked detailed questions about the temperature displays and battery status. When Mark mentioned the generator had nearly run out of fuel, her expression darkened. She stepped out of the room to make urgent phone calls. While Mark sat in the conference room answering the same questions from different agents with slight variations, a massive operation was unfolding at his property. Dr. Vance returned after 30 minutes with new instructions. Mark would not be allowed to return to his property indefinitely. Federal authorities were establishing a secure perimeter around the silo and conducting a full assessment of the materials inside. More concerning, she informed him that his property was being temporarily seized under national security statutes that allowed the government to take control of locations containing classified materials or weapons. Mark's $15,000 investment had just been confiscated by the federal government. The legal implications hit Mark like a physical blow. He'd purchased the property legally at a public auction. The county had sold it to him with clear title. How could the government simply take it? Dr. Vance explained that the Atomic Energy Act and subsequent national security legislation gave federal authorities sweeping powers when dealing with nuclear materials or classified weapons components. The fact that these materials had been stored secretly didn't change their classification status. The government's position was that Mark had never actually owned the contents of the silo because those contents remained federal property regardless of who owned the land. The purchase had been legitimate, but incomplete. Mark asked the obvious question: would he be compensated? The agents exchanged glances before Dr. Vance responded carefully. That would depend on the outcome of the investigation and whether Mark was found to have violated any federal laws by entering the facility. Mark protested that he couldn't have violated laws protecting a facility he didn't know existed on property he legally owned. The agents acknowledged his point but said the determination wasn't theirs to make. Attorneys from the Department of Justice would be involved. For now, Mark needed to cooperate fully, not discuss the discovery with anyone, and prepare for the possibility of extended legal proceedings. As evening fell on Garrison, the small town found itself at the center of a federal operation unlike anything its residents had ever witnessed. Roads leading to Mark's property were blocked by military vehicles. A no-fly zone was established over the area. Residents living within 2 miles of the silo received visits from federal agents instructing them to remain in their homes until further notice. The official explanation was vague: a hazardous materials incident requiring specialized response. No mention of nuclear materials or classified projects. The government was working hard to contain not just the physical materials, but also the information about their existence. At the property itself, teams of specialists in protective suits entered the silo carrying sophisticated detection and monitoring equipment. Their first priority was assessing the vault's condition and stabilizing its climate control systems. Portable generators were brought in to restore power immediately. Radiation surveys of the interior confirmed what the documents had suggested. The sealed containers held uranium components, specifically enriched uranium that had been designated for weapons systems but never deployed. The vault itself contained what experts identified as complete warhead cores in various stages of assembly, stored and preserved for nearly 40 years. The discovery's magnitude became clear as specialists cataloged the inventory. Project Silverthorn had been a covert operation to hide approximately 64 nuclear weapon components that should have been dismantled and disposed of under arms reduction treaties signed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Instead of following proper disposal protocols, someone within the military or Department of Energy had arranged for these materials to be secretly stored on private land, paying Thomas Whitmore handsomely for his silence and cooperation. The materials had an estimated value of several $100 million on black markets, making them targets for theft by hostile nations or terrorist organizations. Dr. Vance briefed Mark on the situation in general terms, emphasizing how fortunate it was that he'd reported the discovery immediately rather than attempting to exploit it. She explained that the failing climate control system had indeed posed serious risks. While the materials weren't at risk of spontaneous detonation, nuclear weapons require precise triggering mechanisms, the degradation of containment could have led to radiation leakage that would have contaminated the surrounding area. Mark's property, his neighbors' homes, the town of Garrison itself, all could have been exposed to dangerous radiation levels within months if the vault had failed completely. The investigation quickly expanded beyond just securing the materials. Federal agents wanted to know who had authorized Project Silverthorn, who had maintained it over the years, and why it had been abandoned. The documents Mark had photographed became crucial evidence in what was rapidly becoming a major federal investigation. Names from the personnel files were cross-referenced with current government employees and retired military officers. Several individuals identified in the documents were still alive, including a former Air Force colonel named Richard Desmond, who had apparently overseen the operation's establishment. Agents tracked down Colonel Desmond, now 83 years old and living in Arizona. He was brought in for questioning, and, faced with decades-old classified documents bearing his signature, he revealed the truth behind Project Silverthorn. In 1986, as the United States entered arms reduction negotiations with the Soviet Union, certain hardline elements within the military and intelligence community had opposed giving up weapons capabilities. They'd argued that international treaties couldn't be trusted and that America should secretly maintain hidden stockpiles of nuclear materials that could be rapidly weaponized if geopolitical circumstances changed. Desmond described how a small group of officers and Department of Energy officials had diverted materials designated for dismantlement, creating unofficial storage facilities at several locations across the country. The Nebraska silo was just one site. Others existed in Montana, New Mexico, and Wyoming, all on private land, all maintained through similar arrangements with property owners who were paid for silence. The operation had been funded through black budget accounts that were never properly audited. As the Cold War ended and oversight tightened, the conspirators had gradually lost the ability to maintain or retrieve the materials, leaving them hidden and forgotten. The revelation stunned everyone involved in the investigation. This wasn't just one rogue officer or a minor security lapse. This was a systematic conspiracy that had persisted for decades, involving dozens of people across multiple agencies. The implications were staggering. How many other secret storage sites existed? Were all the materials still secure, or had others already been compromised? And most disturbing, if Mark hadn't purchased that property and cut through that door, how long would these weapons components have remained hidden, potentially falling into the wrong hands? Mark spent 3 days in what amounted to federal custody, housed at a hotel in Lincoln, Nebraska's capital city, 2 hours from Garrison. Federal agents maintained constant presence outside his room, ostensibly for his protection, but effectively preventing him from leaving or communicating with anyone. His phone had been confiscated for forensic analysis, though Mark suspected they were more interested in ensuring he hadn't sent information to anyone before reporting the discovery. He was provided with meals, a laptop with heavily restricted internet access, and legal documents to review regarding the government's seizure of his property. The laptop allowed Mark to read news coverage of what was being called a significant hazardous materials incident in rural Nebraska. Major networks had picked up the story, though details remained vague. Reporters noted the unusual federal response, the military presence, and the evacuation of nearby residents. But government spokespeople refused to confirm specifics. Speculation ran wild online. Some theorized it was a chemical weapons accident. Others suggested buried toxic waste. A few conspiracy theorists correctly guessed it involved nuclear materials. None of them knew about Mark or his role in the discovery. On the 4th day, Mark finally met with his court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Jennifer Kowalski who specialized in federal cases. She'd been read into the classified aspects of the case and could discuss details with Mark that couldn't be shared publicly. Kowalski's assessment wasn't encouraging. While Mark hadn't committed any intentional crimes, federal prosecutors were considering charging him with unauthorized access to classified materials and improper handling of nuclear-related information. The charges were largely bureaucratic, ways for the government to maintain legal control over him while the broader investigation continued. Kowalski explained the government's strategy. By charging Mark, or at least threatening charges, they could require him to sign non-disclosure agreements as part of any settlement or plea deal. This would legally prevent him from ever discussing what he'd found or how the government had responded. Mark would be gagged for life, unable to tell his story, unable to warn others about how classified materials had been abandoned on private land. The attorney said she'd negotiate for dropped charges in exchange for his cooperation and silence, but Mark would likely receive no compensation for his property or the months of renovation work he'd invested. The injustice of the situation infuriated Mark. He'd done everything right, purchased property legally, reported a dangerous discovery immediately, cooperated fully with authorities. Yet he was being treated like a criminal, while the actual conspirators who'd hidden nuclear weapons were being handled gently as retired government officials subject to internal review. Kowalski sympathized, but explained this was how national security cases always worked. The government prioritized secrecy over fairness, and individuals who stumbled into classified situations rarely emerged unscathed, regardless of their innocence or good intentions. Meanwhile, the investigation of other Project Silverthorn sites progressed rapidly. Federal teams descended on locations in Montana, New Mexico, and Wyoming identified through Colonel Desmond's testimony and cross-reference documents. 2 sites were found abandoned but intact, their materials still secured in similar climate-controlled vaults. The Montana location's caretaker had died years earlier, and the property had been inherited by family members who'd never investigated the sealed storage building on the back 40 acres. The Wyoming site's caretaker was elderly but alive, still receiving monthly payments from an offshore account funded decades ago. The New Mexico site, however, presented a horrifying discovery. The property had been sold at foreclosure 8 years earlier to a real estate developer who'd demolished the old farm buildings to construct a residential subdivision. The storage facility, cleverly disguised as a storm shelter, had been broken into during demolition. The materials inside, approximately 35 enriched uranium components, were missing. Federal investigators found evidence suggesting theft rather than proper disposal. Someone had recognized what those components were and had stolen them, presumably to sell on black markets. 8 years had passed, meaning those materials could be anywhere in the world by now. This revelation elevated the entire investigation to the highest levels of national security concern. The president was briefed. Intelligence agencies worldwide were alerted to watch for signs of stolen American nuclear materials entering illegal markets. The FBI launched a massive investigation into who had accessed the New Mexico property during demolition and where those materials might have gone. The nightmare scenario, nuclear weapon components in terrorist hands, had potentially already occurred, and no one had known for nearly a decade because the material's existence had never been officially recorded. Mark learned about the New Mexico situation during a meeting with Dr. Vance and senior Justice Department officials. They wanted him to understand the seriousness of what he'd prevented by reporting his discovery. If he hadn't called authorities, if he'd simply walked away, or worse, if he'd tried to sell what he'd found, those Nebraska materials could have suffered the same fate. Dr. Vance's tone was almost grateful, acknowledging that Mark's integrity had potentially saved lives. But gratitude didn't translate to leniency. The government still planned to take his property and bind him to secrecy. After a week of negotiations, Kowalski reached a settlement agreement on Mark's behalf. In exchange for signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and cooperating with ongoing investigations, all potential charges would be dropped. The government would compensate Mark $50,000 for his property, more than triple his purchase price but a fraction of its development potential. Additionally, Mark would receive $25,000 for his renovation costs and legal fees. The total settlement of $75,000 seemed generous numerically but was actually minimal considering what Mark was giving up and the risks he'd faced. Mark signed the agreements on a gray November morning in a federal building in Omaha, surrounded by attorneys and government officials. The non-disclosure agreement was extensive. 42 pages of legal language prohibiting him from discussing virtually anything about his discovery. He couldn't mention Project Silverthorne, the nuclear materials, Thomas Whitmore's involvement, the government's secret storage sites, or even the specific location of his former property. Violation would result in immediate federal prosecution and potential imprisonment for up to 20 years. Mark signed his name, surrendering not just his property but his right to ever tell his own story. The settlement included one unusual provision that Dr. Vance had personally insisted upon. Mark would receive priority notification if the stolen New Mexico materials were ever recovered, or if any connection was discovered between those materials and terrorist activities. The government wanted Mark to understand the consequences of nuclear materials falling into wrong hands to reinforce the importance of his silence. If terrorists ever used stolen American uranium, Mark would know that could have been his discovery, could have been his materials, if he'd made different choices when he cut through that welded silo door. Mark returned to his modest apartment in Omaha carrying nothing but a cashier's check for $75,000 and a profound sense of displacement. His property was gone, seized behind chain-link fences topped with razor wire and guarded by rotating security teams. The farmhouse he'd renovated with his own hands now served as a command center for federal agents conducting long-term monitoring of the secured materials. The silo itself had been reinforced and upgraded with modern security systems, transformed from an abandoned agricultural structure into a permanent government storage facility that would likely remain classified for decades. Everything Mark had worked for had been erased, replaced by a secret he could never share. The non-disclosure agreement haunted him. Mark had signed similar documents before in his engineering career, standard confidentiality clauses protecting proprietary information. But this was different. This NDA covered not just technical details but his own experience, his own life. He couldn't tell friends why he'd sold his property. He couldn't explain to his elderly parents why he'd abandoned his renovation project. When former colleagues asked about his plans, Mark had to fabricate vague stories about zoning problems and permit issues. The truth remained locked behind federal classification, and Mark was its prisoner. Weeks passed, then months. Mark tried to resume his normal life and real estate business, but nothing felt the same. He'd seen behind the curtain of government secrecy and discovered that some truths were deliberately hidden, buried in rural America where curious citizens might stumble upon them. The experience had changed his perspective fundamentally. He looked at abandoned properties differently now, wondering what other secrets might be sealed behind welded doors and forgotten storage facilities. How many other Thomas Whitmores existed, paid to guard classified materials that official records claimed didn't exist? The settlement money provided some financial cushion, but it couldn't compensate for what Mark had lost. Beyond the property itself, he'd lost his sense of security in the legal system he'd always trusted. The government had seized his land, threatened him with prosecution for discovering their secret, and paid him a fraction of fair market value, all legally, all within their authority under national security statutes most Americans had never heard of. Mark researched similar cases and found dozens of instances where private citizens had been silenced after discovering classified operations. His situation wasn't unique. It was standard procedure. Mark's isolation deepened as the classified nature of his experience prevented him from seeking normal support systems. He couldn't discuss his frustration with friends or family. Therapy was complicated because he couldn't share the actual source of his stress without violating the NDA. Support groups for people dealing with property loss or legal battles didn't understand the unique trauma of being silenced by your own government. Mark existed in a strange limbo, carrying knowledge he couldn't share and grief he couldn't fully express. By spring, 6 months after his discovery, Mark received the first update Dr. Vance had promised. Federal investigators had made progress tracing the stolen New Mexico materials. Security footage from the demolition site, recovered from archived files, showed a subcontractor loading sealed containers into an unmarked truck in 2017. The individual had been identified as Marcus Chen, a demolition worker with a background in nuclear engineering who'd been dismissed from a Department of Energy facility years earlier for security violations. Chen had recognized exactly what those components were and had stolen them deliberately. The investigation revealed that Chen had attempted to sell the stolen uranium through intermediaries to several hostile nation-states, but the deals had fallen through due to authentication concerns and fears of law enforcement stings. Unable to find legitimate buyers, Chen had apparently retained the materials, storing them in a warehouse in Los Angeles. In March, federal agents raided the warehouse and recovered 32 of the 35 stolen components. 3 remained unaccounted for, possibly sold to unknown buyers or hidden elsewhere. The recovery was considered a major success, though the missing components represented continued security threats. Chen was arrested and charged with theft of government property, unauthorized possession of nuclear materials, and attempted weapons trafficking. His case proceeded through federal court under heavy security and classification restrictions. Mark followed the limited public reporting, knowing details that never appeared in news coverage. He knew those materials had come from the same operation that created his Nebraska silo. He knew Chen's theft had been possible only because materials that should have been dismantled and destroyed had instead been hidden away by conspiracy. But Mark couldn't discuss any of this publicly without violating his NDA. The Chen case raised uncomfortable questions that government officials struggled to answer without revealing classified details. How had nuclear materials ended up in a demolished building's storm shelter? Why hadn't those materials been tracked by official inventory systems? Who had been responsible for their security? The official answers were vague and unsatisfying, citing ongoing investigations and classification requirements. But some journalists were starting to connect dots, researching Cold War-era nuclear programs and discovering gaps in official dismantlement records. The truth about Project Silverthorne was slowly emerging despite government efforts to contain it. In June, Mark received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Kowalski, his attorney. She'd been contacted by a journalist from a major national newspaper investigating historical nuclear weapons storage programs. The reporter had obtained documents through Freedom of Information Act requests showing irregularities in weapons dismantlement protocols during the late 1980s. The reporter knew about facilities in Nebraska, Montana, Wyoming, and New Mexico. They were looking for people willing to talk about these programs. Kowalski warned Mark that speaking to journalists would violate his NDA and result in immediate prosecution. Mark thanked her for the warning and ended the call. But the temptation lingered. Mark wrestled with his conscience. The story needed to be told. Americans deserved to know that nuclear weapons components had been hidden on private land for decades, that some had been stolen, that others might still remain undiscovered. The public had a right to understand how national security apparatus could operate so completely outside democratic oversight. But Mark also understood the consequences of speaking out. He'd be prosecuted, imprisoned, financially ruined. His family would suffer. Was the truth worth that price? Mark didn't know, but the question consumed him as summer approached and the journalist continued investigating Project Silverthorne's secrets. By August, the journalist's investigation had progressed far enough to publish without Mark's cooperation. The story broke on a Sunday morning, spanning the front page and 3 full inside pages of one of America's most respected newspapers. The headline read, "Secret Cold War Nuclear Storage Network Discovered on Private Land Across America." The article detailed Project Silverthorne extensively, naming Colonel Desmond and other conspirators, describing the storage sites, and revealing the theft of materials from New Mexico. Government officials immediately condemned the publication, claiming it endangered national security, but the information was already spreading worldwide. Mark read the article multiple times, amazed at how much the journalist had uncovered without his help. Documents obtained through FOIA requests, interviews with retired military officials, and persistent investigation of property records had revealed most of the story. The article didn't name Mark specifically, referring to him only as a Nebraska property owner who discovered the materials and immediately reported them to authorities. His role was acknowledged but not detailed, protecting him from potential NDA violations. Mark felt vindicated yet frustrated. The truth was public, but he still couldn't share his personal experience. The article's publication triggered immediate political consequences. Congressional committees announced investigations into how such a massive operation could have remained hidden for decades. Senators demanded accountability, asking who had authorized the program and why oversight had failed so completely. The Department of Energy and Department of Defense scrambled to respond, issuing carefully worded statements acknowledging historical security lapses while insisting current protocols prevented such problems. But the damage to public trust was severe. Americans learned their government had lost track of nuclear weapons components, and some had been stolen by criminals. Public reaction mixed outrage with fascination. Social media exploded with discussions about government secrecy, nuclear security, and the risks of classified operations operating beyond normal accountability. Conspiracy theories flourished, some claiming the disclosed sites were only a fraction of secret facilities that remained hidden. Others argued the entire story was disinformation designed to distract from other government activities. Mainstream commentators debated the balance between national security and transparency, disagreeing on whether such secrets were ever justified even during Cold War tensions. Mark watched the public discourse with complex emotions. Part of him wanted to join the conversation, to share his first-hand experience of discovering the silo and facing government power. But his NDA remained binding regardless of what information had become public. He could discuss only what appeared in published articles, not his personal knowledge or documents he'd seen. Mark consulted with Kowalski about whether the article's publication changed his legal situation. She confirmed it didn't. His agreement covered information he'd obtained directly, not information others had independently discovered and published. The congressional investigations progressed through fall, calling witnesses and reviewing classified documents. Colonel Desmond testified publicly, though many specifics remained classified and discussions happened in closed sessions. He expressed no regret for his actions, arguing that maintaining hidden weapons capabilities had been necessary for national security during uncertain times. His testimony revealed that Project Silverthorn hadn't been the only covert operation. Other programs had hidden different types of classified materials at various locations. The full scope of Cold War-era secrecy remained unclear, but evidence suggested systematic efforts to circumvent official oversight. Several property owners came forward after the article's publication, revealing their own experiences with sealed storage facilities and government lease payments. A Montana rancher described receiving monthly checks for 20 years to maintain a sealed bunker on his land, told it contained emergency communications equipment but never permitted to look inside. An Arizona landowner told of military personnel accessing a secured underground facility on her property quarterly for decades, refusing to explain what they were protecting. These stories suggested Project Silverthorn represented a broader pattern of using private land to hide classified operations from official scrutiny. Mark felt less alone knowing others had similar experiences, but their situations differed in crucial ways. None of them had discovered and opened the facilities themselves. None faced the same level of government pressure or restrictive NDAs. They'd been knowing participants paid for their complicity, while Mark had been an unknowing discoverer punished for his curiosity. The distinction mattered legally and morally. Mark remained bound by secrecy while others could freely discuss their roles because they'd never agreed to classification restrictions. By December, 1 year after Mark's discovery, federal reforms were being implemented. New regulations required comprehensive audits of all nuclear materials in government custody, with regular inspections and multi-agency oversight. Private land could no longer be used for classified storage without explicit congressional notification. Whistleblower protections were strengthened for government employees who reported security violations. The reforms looked impressive on paper, but Mark remained skeptical. The same government that had hidden weapons for decades was now promising transparency. Would these reforms survive beyond the current political attention? Or would they gradually erode as memory faded and other priorities emerged? Mark received his final contact from Dr. Vance in January. She called to inform him that all materials from the Nebraska site had been properly disposed of through official channels, following international treaty protocols. The silo itself was being decommissioned and filled with concrete, eliminating any future security risks. His property would eventually be released from federal control and sold at auction, though it might take years for the legal processes to complete. Dr. Vance thanked Mark again for his integrity in reporting the discovery, acknowledging that his actions had probably prevented the materials from being stolen like those in New Mexico. Then she reminded him that his NDA remained permanently binding regardless of what information had become public. Mark understood. Some secrets he would carry to his grave, no matter how the larger story evolved. The door he'd cut open had changed his life forever, and he would never be completely free of what he'd found behind that welded steel entrance in the silent Nebraska countryside. Now we want to hear from you. What would you do if you discovered something like this on your property? Would you report it immediately like Mark, or would you handle it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible discovery. We cover the most mysterious and unbelievable stories from across America. And trust us, there are more secrets hidden out there than you could ever imagine. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.